morning, everyone. Thanks for joining us. Had a few technical complications there. As we get started on the results are in what makes Australian church plants work. I'm your host today, Ben McConnell. We have got an action-packed extravaganza heading your way, so I'm going to get to it real quick. Before I do, just a quick but very full of gratitude thanks to those who make this webinar possible. EA Insurance. Geneva Push would really like to thank EA Insurance. If you haven't sorted out your insurance needs yet, you should head across to eainsurance.com.au and do that right now. They can help you with all your insurance needs for church plants. Now, before we do get started, just a few technical things about the webinar today. Your view panel, where you're seeing my video feed come through right now. If you want to increase the size of me, which you probably do, go to the bottom right-hand corner of the view panel, and you can just enlarge the view pane like that. Fantastic. And now, when you want to send questions through today, we're going to have a period of questions for about 10 minutes at the end of our session today. A big 10 minutes of questions coming your way. If you want to send questions through to me, and I'll get them through to our guests today, go to the chat window, pop your questions through to the host, and I'll get them sent off to our lead interviewer today, who is our Executive Director, Geneva Push's own Scott Sanders. I'm going to hand across to Scott now to get this underway and to introduce you to our very special guest.
Thanks, Ben. It's great to have you here for our third webinar of the year, one that I've been looking forward to, an opportunity for us to actually share some of the research that we've been working on over the last 6 months with Lifeway Research in the United States. Let me tell you quickly about our two guests today. We've got Ed Stetzer, who many of you know. He's a husband, a father of 3 daughters. He's the Executive Director of Lifeway Research. He writes lots. He thinks lots about church planning. He's not only planted churches, he's revitalised churches and also pastors a church currently in Nashville in Tennessee. It's great to have Ed here today. We've also got Scott McConnell, a director at Lifeway Research. Scott was, I guess, the project leader on this research. Scott is a husband and father of 2 teenagers, and he's been working with Lifeway Research for close to 10 years and has been involved in some really key research into multi-site, parenting, transformational discipleship, and into a key tool into understanding church planning competencies. It's great to have you both here today, Scott and Ed. So welcome.
Thanks. Good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for having us. It's not as exciting as being in Down Under, but we're happy to be able to at least communicate via Skype and feel some of the awesomeness of Oz.
Now, you guys are obviously always working on research. What are you working on other than this Australian research at the moment?
Right now, the great mystery that we're trying to research right now is the American electorate, and we've largely decided to give up on this. There's no current explanation for our current situation.
No rhyme or reason to the people. Anyway, the people will decide. It'll be an interesting outcome. Well, let's get down to the research. Ed, it'd be great if you could share with us the methodology. Tell us what have you guys been doing?
Yeah, of course. The research project is actually done both in the U.S., in Australia, and in Canada. It gives us a nice sample to kind of compare across regions, nations, and continents. And so in doing so, we wanted to get a picture of kind of what's the best practices. Now studies like this can't answer every question, and so we're not trying to answer every question, but by doing a larger sample that goes across nations, what we're able to do is we're able to find certain characteristics that track. So, for example, if we look at the sample as a whole, we have a disproportionate number of U.S. church planners, which wouldn't surprise you considering the population size, the evangelical presence, and more. Because we have 3 nations in a sample, we can actually learn some things and say, well, this is similar, and so there's similarity across these things. So what happens is that a smaller sample in Canada gets mixed with a larger sample, and the end result is that you get a more robust study. In other words, Australians are benefiting from Canadians and Americans who've also done this study as well. So let me just jump right in and talk some about the Australian Church Planting Survey. It's a survey of 110 new church works there in Australia. Let me begin by just unpacking some of the methodology. So the methodology is the questionnaires fielded from October of 15 to February of 16. And what we did is we actually individually invited them to complete these surveys online by email and phone. We actually had about a 15% respond rate. It's actually a little higher because we didn't survey church plants that had closed. So, so this is an analysis of 110 church plants started in 2000 or later that exist today, and were started as plants, church restarts, or new church sites. Now, breaking it down by state, we have, of course, New South Wales is the largest, Victoria after that, and then it goes on from there. So Queensland, Western Australia, Tasmania, South Australia, and the Capital Territory all are represented there. Now, just a little background on the sample itself, right? So 30% of the new church works were started since 2013. So you see sort of a mix, and we want to be careful. You don't want to overload a sample with 2015 data because you don't know enough about what's going to happen, what's had an influence, what's not had an influence. Nor do you want to overload it with something that's 20 years old. So by looking at things that give us a 15-year window from now until 2013, we get a picture at different stages, and we can actually look at it and say, oh, what happens at the third, fourth, fifth year? What are some things that they've done after the 10th year? Now, the religious group or denomination is that begins these groups. Now, let me say, this is important because this is of our sample. We're not saying that Baptists plant 18% of the churches in Australia, but because we had Baptist participation, the FIEC and Anglicans and Presbyterians and actually a lower participation, for example, among the Australian Christian churches, we get a mix. But what we can say is that in our sample, this is what we learned, or this is what we ultimately saw. The next page gives some more of the details. So we have a wide distribution of church denominations involved. CRC, C3 Church itself, and again, I don't want to leave anybody out because people are probably watching. Like, you didn't mention us, Fellowship of Evangelical Congregation, Evangelical Churches, Vineyard, Independent, non-denominational, and then Fellowship of Congregational Churches, all were represented in the study. Now, the obvious question is, in our sample, where are we drawing from in our sample? Well, we're drawing from primarily residential, some mixed use. What was interesting to me was, and I think it's probably reflective not of our sample, but of the situation on the ground, is that city centers and CBDs are actually low. It's only 8%. Now again, I guess I probably have a little bit of a particular interest in that because of my engagement with some of the CBD communities there in Australia. But you can kind of get a picture for kind of what describes the place immediately around where they live. Now, Scott, why don't you talk to us a little bit more? I've kind of given the slides, but give us a little more. Scott Sanders. I know I'm Scott McConnell. We have two Scotts on the, which is a problem. So sorry. But when I say Scott, I mean my favorite Scott. So you decide which one that is. So Scott McConnell. Scott, why don't you share a little bit about some of the things that a sample like this can tell us, and maybe some things it can't necessarily tell us.
This is a nice large sample with over 100 congregations participating. That's going to give us enough churches that we can slice it a couple different ways. We can look to see what might predict some of the better outcomes. But we have to keep in mind that frame, we had a number of specific denominations that supplied lists and that we contacted. And so somebody who's starting a plant on their own, they're going to be a little off the radar, so to speak. And so they would not be included in the frame of this research. But we're definitely grateful for those who have shared lists. And, a lot of legwork went into making sure that all along the way, we were doing everything we could to keep those folks engaged and to participate if they possibly were willing. So multiple emails, multiple phone calls, and really it's a census from these denominations. And so there's not a margin of error like we're typically hearing from a poll. It's a census. Everybody was asked multiple times to participate. And again, we got a pretty good response rate from these participating denominations.
And as you said, Ed and Scott, we had a 15% response rate. We undertook a census about 3 or 4 years ago where we identified about 850 church plants. It's often hard to find data on the church plants that close that aren't successful, and so as Ed said at the start, very hard to put that data into the into the study as well. But we've got a broad denominational representation here. We've got church plants from the last 10 years. And, you know, interestingly, as Ed said in that last slide that's on the screen there, I think it's, you know, to what extent, I guess, is this sample reflective of Australia? I mean, already, Ed, you've brought in the CBD. You would expect more church plants in a CBD city centre area in the United States. Is that a fair comparison with what you see in the United States?
I think Australia is far more urbanized than the United States. You know, Australia is 5 cities with an inland, and so my anticipation, of course, those cities, those residential areas would include would include those cities. I mean, outside of Sydney would include the residential area, but I think that my hope and desire would be, I think this is reflective of reality, but my hope and desire would be that we'd see more church plants in center cities. Yep. Here as the world urbanizes. So I think ultimately it's just a trend. It's a missiological trend. But statistically, I think probably this is a good reflection of the current reality. Every research project is a reflection of reality. It's not a perfect statement of reality, but because of the diversity of denominations represented, I wanted to make sure that we had, we have Pentecostals, we have Spirit-filled movements, we have Baptists, we have Presbyterians, we have Anglicans, and I'm not saying these are mutually exclusive categories, but yeah. So as I look at the data as the project kind of overseer, I'm looking at this and saying this is getting us a good picture of reality. But there's certain things it's not trying to get. It's not trying to tell us. It's not an autopsy, So yep. We're not looking at dead church plants. What it is we're looking at what makes church plants that are that exist, what makes them do better or best. And I think we have a good solid sample and the ability to compare it to other tracking samples to get a picture of what's going on in the Australian context.
So Craig from New South Wales asked the question: How can we make most use of this survey? I guess that's a good question to sort of kick us off. How can we make most use of this survey?
Yeah, well, probably the part we just went through is not the part that I would necessarily use for anything particularly exciting. That you have to ask the question. This is what we do as researchers. Does this define reality? Yep. Now, particularly as non-Australians, McConnell and I as non-Australians, we have to ask that question as a statistical thing, and then we run it with you, Scott, has been our lead partner there, and say, yeah, this reflects reality. So I think the next few slides, and when we're ready to go there, so make sure if anyone has questions about methodology, we're happy to address them. But the next few slides, I think, gets at, and we'll be able to say, here's how you want to function. Here's things you want to learn and take from this data.
Well, let's have a look at some of the key outcomes then.
Yeah. Okay, so some of the things that we see or saw here is to kind of get a picture of what's going on. Is we move from methodology and we go to some of the outcomes. Now, first, one of the most important things is to have a realistic definition of reality. And I think for a lot of people, you go to an American church planting conference, and I was speaking a few years ago at Saddleback, and Rick Warren's small struggling church there in Southern California, and every speaker except me had planted the church or started the church they were pastoring. There were 9 speakers. The smallest had 5,000 in attendance. The largest had 30,000 in attendance, and then there was me. It was like an old rhyme. One of these things is not like the other, and that was me. And I actually said that. I said, here's the danger of a conference like this. They're coming and listening to these people, and I was talking about church planting, and I said, you might think this is normal. All these speakers up here, this is not normal. So what is normal? Well, this is part of what we're trying to define in the Australian context. So here's what's normal. The normal Australian church plant does not break 100 after 4 years. Now that is either discouraging or liberating. It might be both. Well, let me explain why it might be both. Because it might be discouraging because people say, well, man, I want it to be running, 200. There are, we could give examples in Australia of churches that are running to 200 in 2 or 3 years. Yep. But the reality is that's just not normal. And one of the things we'll see later, if you enter into this endeavor thinking that that's normal, or maybe you heard a conference speaker, say that, and let me just say this too, everybody who speaks at a conference is there because they didn't have a normal experience. So I think one of the first things I want to take away from the data is that Australia and Canada actually have similar patterns when it comes to church attendance for churches that survive that typically after 4 years they haven't broken 100 in attendance. Now in the U.S. sample, it's a little larger, so you can actually see the comparison. And we don't do that to say one's better or one's worse. We're just simply saying the reality is this is put this under the incredibly obvious statement made by an American. It's harder to plant a church in Australia than it is to plant a church in the U.S. But it's not dissimilar numerically to the Canadian context, and that might be worth noticing that on several places we'll find that Australia and Canada track similarly, and we can learn from that, and several places where they go a different direction.
So what about newcomer?
Yeah, so this is the next thing. Average number of new commitments to Christ. Now here we find both Australia and Canada are similar. Now you'll notice that Australia and in Canada, the number is 8 the first year is kind of the normal number, and then 6 and 6. Australia starts a little lower and gets up to 5, but the numbers are quite different in the U.S. and this is just a typical church plant. So what does that tell us? Well, I think it again tells us that evangelism is both needed, but also perhaps more challenging in the Australian context. But let me also say that some of that may be cultural. Now, this is my field. My area is PhD in missiology. Is in some cultures, talking about religion and talking about inviting people to religious things is more welcome than in others. And the U.S. is a particularly open place to talk about religion. Our current election cycle will be a perfect example of that. Americans are more religious as far as attending congregations than actually Iranians are. So it's a pretty religious culture where people invite and evangelize each other more. And I think we see perhaps more of a reticence to do that. Let's look at and Scott. Scott McConnell. Feel free you to jump in on these two. Weekly worship attendance and new commitments to Christ. Help us to kind of put this in frame a little bit. What would you take from this that might be helpful for Australian church planners?
Two things. One is what you see in the United States is there gets to be some momentum, and we don't tend to see that in Canada and Australia. And so, reaching 3 in the first year, reaching another 3 in the second, that's commendable. That's actually multiplication. You're doing it again. You're doing the addition again. That is multiplication. But somehow in the United States, there gets to be some momentum where you're reaching even more. But because there's some attendance growth, it means you're actually reaching fewer people per attendee over time. And so some of what the church plant is starting with in its ethos is getting lost. And I do think that's of more concern than the comparison to the United States. Because the soil is definitely different, but whatever they had the first year, as their attendance starts to grow, they should be able, in theory, you should be able to get more new commitments over those couple of years as well.
Yeah, it's interesting as well that this is new commitments and not de-churched or people who have been in the church haven't been in church for 5 years as well. I think one of the things that we see amongst our church plants in the Geneva Push Network is a lot of almost same size of de-churched as well. But we'll come to that data in a moment. But that's really helpful to talk about momentum and the slowness of growth. I think that's helpful for us to hear as Australians in an Australian church planting context.
I think there's some insight there I don't want you to miss from McConnell as well. Is when he talks about, there is something when I teach church planting in the States, particularly in certain parts. I tell them for example, the large launches, you begin with 200 people, you keep 100. That's a very familiar thing for church planters in the States, very unfamiliar in Australian context. But I will tell you, having planted churches, I guess I'm on my 6th church plant now. If I can plant with 200 and keep 100, I get momentum in the second year, and it just keeps going, and I start seeing more and more conversions. But I think church planting is more of a long, hard slog. And a slog's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just what that is. And so I think realistic expectations are really key to have as we kind of move forward. So let me jump back into the data.
Stuart just asked the numbers we're talking about here. We're talking about adults here. We're not including children. Is that right?
Scott, go ahead. McConnell, what does it include?
For attendees, it includes all ages. For new commitments, it is a commitment to Christ. So we're not talking about infant baptisms or just a birth in the family. It's definitely somebody who's made a commitment, but it could be a child.
So it's conversion growth rather than biological growth.
Yep.
Correct.
Great. Okay, I'll move to the next slide then, Scott.
Okay. So let's talk some about financial self-sufficiency. Scott, you want to jump in on this one?
Yeah, so this is the third outcome type variable. And of course, depending on the type of church plant, you might put more emphasis on one of these outcomes than another. But this is obviously a convenient outcome that you're hoping to have in your church plant, is to reach financial self-sufficiency. And so the question is, when do you achieve that, or if you achieve that? And among the Australian church plants, we do see that a majority have reached financial self-sufficiency, but just barely. 45% have not reached that point. So this is actually a little better than in the Canadian data, and a little bit worse than in the United States. And in Canada and the United States, we were looking at a little bit different time frames, a little bit shorter. So you had a little bit longer in Australia, going all the way back to 2000 for your plants to be included. But obviously this is a goal, and we'll look at a couple of things that might contribute to better financial self-sufficiency. But obviously the other thing we can take away from this is, if you're not getting there or close to it in the first 3 years, it's a lot harder after that window to reach financial self-sufficiency.
Yep.
Okay. You want me to continue, Scott? You go ahead. Talk about one more, Scott McConnell.
All right. The fourth outcome we looked at is, especially for some of the more organic plants, I think they would appreciate this one a little more than necessarily just the raw attendance number at a worship service. But I think all churches would appreciate you exist to try to reach the lost, to reach the unchurched at least, to try to win the de-churched back. And so this just asks, in your congregation, how many were previously completely unchurched, how many have been unchurched for many years, or we often say de-churched, and then how many were previously part of other churches. They transferred from another church in, and how many, the organic growth, children born to people attending your church, and then from other church background. And we see those first two categories are essentially our target, I think, with any church plant, which is trying to reach the lost, to reach the de-churched. And so a third of attendees in the average church, new church work that we were surveying, a third of those are unchurched. And we don't have other Australian data to put next to this, but definitely in other contexts, we see church plants outpacing long-standing churches in terms of this number. So that's definitely a good number, and Canada and U.S. as comparison are a little bit ahead of that, but definitely there's a lot to be thankful for there in those people being reached. Definitely there's transfer growth. That is the biggest number in any context, even though that's not what we're trying to do. We do need some of those core members to get a church plant started, and so we definitely need some to be a part of the equation, and then some of the organic growth kind of picking up the last couple pieces.
Yeah, of course, these are self-reported, but in Australian culture and many others, people don't tend to drastically exaggerate. Maybe here in the States are a little more common to do that. But looking at these numbers, people often ask me what percentage of people should be unchurched. I think it's great if you can have a church that gets to 50%. But these kind of self-reported numbers, I mean, we actually have pretty good engagement in unchurched people as well. And so again, I don't find anything particularly disconcerting here, but instead rather some, and of course Australia is a more secular society. It's a target-rich environment when it comes to opportunities for evangelism, and so I think we see that here.
I think the fact we're actually asking the question is putting a spotlight on it. It's actually forcing us to be asking the hard questions. Are we actually reaching unchurched people? Are we actually, doing the work of evangelism in our church plants? So Craig asked this question from New South Wales. What other cultures are mostly or closely aligned to the Aussie context? He says, given the wide gulf between US culture and Aussie culture, should we be looking most closely at what, I guess, works in London, Paris, Naples, or Singapore? Can you give some insight into that, given that we've, got this helpful spread now of US, Canada, and Australia?
Yeah, I actually don't think that London, Singapore are probably the best. I think what we see is a close tracking to Canada. And maybe this shouldn't surprise us. We hope to get a UK sample as well. We're still working towards that. But I do think that one of the things that and I hope I'm going to cautiously use my words. Yep. That's always a dangerous thing when somebody says they're about to cautiously use their words. I think that but what we see in our data is church planting in Australia is not radically different than church planting in the rest of the English-speaking Western world. It is harder soil. It's slower work. It probably looks a lot statistically, when we have a larger sample, it probably looks a lot statistically like the northeast of the United States, yep, which doesn't really look like, London, Singapore in the same sort of way. Or the Pacific Northwest of the United States, or Canada as a whole. So what I would say is definitely there are differences worth noting that we can see. But at the same time, I think part of the bigger picture is that there's some commonality that enable us to track and see some of the patterns across the nation. So, because I got to remember too, you look at like Australia, the U.S. was not one place. I've planted churches in the Northeast United States. It's very different than where I'm planting churches here today. So what I would say is we can actually look at, matter of fact, I could pull up right now the Northeast sample, and the Northeast sample of our study looks like the Australian sample. And so I think that's worth noting, that there's going to be, so rather than London, maybe Boston would be a better comparison to Australia, and where London is even more post-Christian and more decidedly secular.
Yep. Okay, that's helpful. I mean, it'd be great to see a study of London as well. It'd be interesting to see the results of that. But really,
and keep in mind too that I'm sorry, Scott. There's that kind of delay on the video. I wasn't sure you were still done. Keep in mind too that Sydney's CBD is different than Melbourne. I mean, or a Melbourne residential community or suburb. So all these things are, there's not an Australia. There's a whole bunch of contexts that are there, and some are remarkably secular. The Gold Coast is very different than wherever else than Perth, for example. So that's. But when we look at Australia as a whole, and I compare it numerically to the Northeast United States, I see a lot of similarities, and Canada fits that. So those three, if I could take the Northeast United States, Canada, Australia, they'd make a nice sample of similar numbers.
That's really helpful, Ed. What people are wanting to find out from today's webinar, though, is actually what makes church plants most effective. What is it that we can be doing to be thoroughly equipped? So both David, Titus, Ralph, we had heaps of pre-questions. They want to hear what actually works. Now, obviously, it's God who builds the church, and obviously the Holy Spirit's needed to powerfully work in the lives of people. But statistically speaking, what can we what makes church plants work? Can you tell us what we found in the study?
I guess I'd like to spend more time talking about methodology and patterns. I guess to the practical things. So So hey, listen, I just updated planting missional churches to the next edition. Daniel Im co-authors with me. He's a Korean Canadian, and we actually, for the first time now, will have Australian examples. So we're quite excited about this. So some of the research here has helped us in the book that we've just kind of redone. So anyway, so let's jump in. Let's talk some about these things. First, let's talk in the area of support. What we're looking for is things that impact weekly worship attendance. So that's sort of the measure we're using here. If you wore blue, was your church larger than if you wore yellow? And so we looked at some of those things. Well, let's take a look at some of the distinctions between the two. So, for example, now some of these will be not necessarily intuitive for you. You might ask the question, well, if they pray, is their church larger? Well, here's the thing. Everybody prays. So you don't have a sample to compare between the two. But, for example, churches conducting a membership class actually has some statistical impact on the attendance of the church. And in year 1 it has less of 1, but by the time you get to year 4, and looking at that pattern, if that pattern continued, it would double in year 5. What we find is that a membership classes. Now, why would that be? Why would well, I mean, I can...
Ed, can you just tell us what is a membership course for those who don't, run membership courses in their church?
It's going to be some sort of training program for people who are signing up to be members of the church, who will go through and maybe sign a covenant or, sign on a dotted line or actually go through a course. So there's some sort of initiating training, what the church believes, maybe the gospel shared, maybe the church covenant shared, whatever it may be. Now, we didn't define it with a huge amount of detail. I'm just explaining in general. Yeah. But here's what we find. Those that do, now why? Why? Because it appears they're building a community. This is my professional opinion, not necessarily directly from the numbers, but they're building a community. Now I've actually done 5 major church planning studies. And in all 5 of the major church planning studies, starting with my PhD dissertation, and then multiple ones in the U.S., Canada, now in Australia, we have always found this membership thing to be a key driving factor in attendance. So why? Well, because I think you're building a community together in that new church. But let's look on the other side too. The congregation enlisting prayer partners, people on the outside. We actually see over years that when a congregation, now why would this be? Now, well, we can't, we're people of faith, we're Christians. We can say prayer itself had indeed the direct impact. But I'm guessing that people who had no prayer partners still prayed and people were praying in the church. But these things both point to a really key intentionality. Yep. And intentionality is going to be a recurring theme, Scott, that we're going to talk about, is intentionality in membership, intentionality in building a coalition to help plant the church. So over and over again, we see this reality. Now, Scott McConnell, talk to us about the next slide. Talks about the quarter unchurched and how the congregation is sort of funded, because this is another interesting picture.
So we just looked at 2 things that predict higher attendance. In this case, we're looking at what might impact reaching at least a quarter of your congregation being unchurched. Mm-hmm. And in this case, it meant that the pastor and church staff had some money or some skin in the game, as we say, as the saying goes. So they personally were contributing financially to make this thing work. And I know that, when a new business is getting off the ground and they're going to get some financing, one of the questions that you're asked when you go to get financing is, what have you contributed? And when the financiers realize that you've put not only your sweat equity into it, but you've put finances into it, then they feel like the risk is lower. Okay, I'm willing to buy in. And so while here we're looking at the outcome is not a financial outcome. The outcome is, are we winning the lost? And sometimes that means we're sacrificing financially ourselves when we're on that planting team to make it happen. And, if you're not willing to do that, chances are you're probably not willing to go the extra mile on some of the ministry things that are going to make this happen. And people see that. People who are joining the team and taking a look at the church, they're going to see that, and maybe they won't go the extra mile either to reach out to somebody that doesn't know Christ.
Yeah, so it's an interesting number here, because 67% of congregations funded directly from a church's pastor or staff are a quarter unchurched. So in other words, this is positively impacting evangelism. The next slide talks about how it's positively impacting evangelism. 59% of congregations financially contribute to other church plants are a quarter unchurched. So in other words, they have a heart and outward passion. There's a correlation here between the two, that in a desire to be involved in church planting, it probably has a positive impact on the church. That if the church I'm in right now, I planted 4 years ago, and just by the way, transition. As of Sunday, I'm no longer the pastor of that church. I'm now the teaching pastor. But from the first Sunday, we said we're going to be a church planting church. On our very first week, we took up our offering and said 100% of this is going to go to our first church plant. We subsequently planted a team to plant in Brazil, sent a team to plant in another town near us, about an hour away. That impacts us. It helps people to see how we are outwardly focused. Now, transitioning to financially self-sufficient. Now, always look at the little blue thing in the upper right-hand corner. That's telling you what I'm talking about. So when it comes to financially self-sufficiency, and this is kind of this kind of odd thing, but I want you to see this because there's a statistical something at work here statistically, is that the idea of centralized support is something that a lot of people have asked me about over the years. Ed, if we could have, one organization like in Melbourne do the accounting, and that denomination could do the accounting, or whatever else it may be, does that help? And it does. It actually does. We actually see some impact. Now, this didn't exist a while ago, but now as denominations are stepping into this space more. So what I would say is, if a church planter, in Brisbane has to do all of the administrative work and basically reinvent the wheel, file the necessary paperwork to do everything, then that slows down the process and to getting to self-sufficiency.
So by accounting help, Ed, you're not only talking, just actually running the books. You're actually talking about, administration, filing the forms with the ATO, helping work out, the budget, putting together that stewardship plan. It's those sort of central services that you'd see in I guess, in a multi-site.
What I want to say, Scott Sanders, is that that's indicative, I think, of the bigger issue, because central services could be helping to developing an advertising strategy too. So my point is that this number points us to a positive impact that is probably reflective of several things, not just one thing.
Yep. That's really helpful. So it's really helpful to see the sacrifice of the church plan is important, the generosity of the church is important, and also, I guess, being planned, prepared, is important as well, which moves us to, I guess, experience and the importance of experience. Scott, can you tell us about, what did you learn in terms of experience?
Whenever a church planter has been a part of a church planting team in the past, they're much more prepared for what's going to happen and really for the growth in that church. And so the outcome here is growth in worship attendance over the first 4 years. And really we see a difference every year if that planter has been a part of a church planting team in the past. So as they're facing daily challenges, the fact that they've been there before, either facing them themselves or watching somebody else face them, they're prepared for that. They're ready for that, and they don't get stuck quite as long on each of those. And so, this is where mentoring programs and apprentice programs are just a great idea and a great investment because it's preparing people for those decisions and how to navigate conversations, some of the tough conversations you've got to have with folks, how to handle conflict, all those kinds of things that can come up over the course of several years. You're just much better prepared when you've been there and you've done that.
Now, Ed, you talk about planting pregnant, not actually being pregnant or your wife being pregnant when you're planting, but actually having church planners within you who are ready to get sent out in the next 2 or 3 years, which I think is a really helpful thing to encourage church planners to be doing. Can you talk about the importance of prior bivocational ministry? Because I found this an interesting slide. You're not encouraging bivocational planning, but definitely having bivocational experience is important. Is that what this slide's
telling you?
Let
me say with 30 that we are encouraging bivocational church planning. We think that's going to be the key to planting churches that the English-speaking Western world. However, in this case, that's not what this slide is. And this slide basically shows that those who have some bivocational experience actually tend to have, and I'm making a conclusion here, but they have higher numbers. Let me make the conclusion. They're probably better at evangelism because they've actually not solely gone through the pathway of, a professional ecclesiological and theological and everything else. They've actually got some real world engagement. And so we actually see that here in these numbers. And it leads to the next one too. And as I look at the slides and the time, I'm thinking we better speed this up. So let me move a little quicker.
Yeah, we better. Yeah.
Yeah. Sorry, I get kind of excited about this, and I'm excited that we actually have Australian data. So thank you for all those of you who are watching for being partners here. So pastor's expectation were met with reality. This is a really key thing. Again, in all the studies we've done, this one comes up. This was one of the 4 key highest factors in one study we did in 2007 is having realistic expectations. That's why coming back to, and I don't want to be discouraging, I want to be encouraging, but when I say that Australian church plants typically don't break 100 after 4 years, you need to say that when you're doing the training, when you're doing, and because people need to know this is going to take a while to actually get there. Now, from there, let's move in and let's talk about some of the intentionality that it takes actually to have a more effective church that's reaching, for example, the unchurched people. Let's just hit a few unchurched stats, right? So if you want more reach more unchurched people, what do? Well, they're still doing prayer walk. When they have a higher percentage of unchurched, they're out there. So they're continuing they're using ministry evangelism. Ministry evangelism we defined as doing acts of mercy. Think ministries of mercy to opportunity to share the gospel. So again, we're seeing these intentionality, prayer walking, ministry evangelism, or community service projects. And I want you to notice too that both prayer walking and community service projects are hands-on, sort of serving others in the name of Jesus. That's a key factor that we find in kind of many cases, many examples of church plants that are actually being effective.
Ed, can you explain for those church planters that haven't done prayer walking? What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Prayer walking is the thing. It's a little less common. Well, it's probably a little less common in organizations named Geneva Push. That's a little more. It's a little more thing in I don't know, in some charismatic circles and things of that sort. But our church does as well. Basically, it's going and walking a community and praying for houses and praying for people and making that prayer priority a focus. So basically walking around a community and praying. Maybe what Paul did in Acts chapter 17. He says he was within the city of Athens. He saw the city was full of idols. His spirit was troubled within him. He was praying. That kind of thing. Is that?
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Yeah, the church plant that I'm a part of in Sydney did that. For the first year. Before they launched publicly. And it's again interesting. It's one of those intentional activities you do at the start, but then now 4 years in, we've stopped walking. We've stopped walking in the community. We've stopped praying intentionally. So I think what's helpful for this as well is to sort of say, hey, for the established church, why can't we be prayer walking? Even now. Why can't we be doing community service projects even now in order to reach the unreached?
A lot of it depends. It's just different in some traditions, and so. My experience has been more Reformed traditions tend to do it less, but I've made the assumption wrong because your church is in the Geneva Push has done it. It's more, I've seen Baptists do it, I've seen Charismatics do it the most. And so, but I guess people do all different kinds do it. The point is the continuing nature of that outreach is really key. So,
well, that is really helpful. We've got, I guess, 3 areas we can really think about: experience, intentionality, and also support. And I guess I really want to say intentionality there. That's a really key word that we want to, I guess, keep pressing into. Being intentional, planning. I guess planning for growth through evangelism. Scott and Ed, we've got a lot of slides to go before question time. So let's go through this last section quite quickly. What do we just learn generally from the Australian research?
All right, let me just plow through some of this stuff. Overview wise. Primary facilities mostly are schools, church buildings number 2, community hall is number 3, and about a third have conducted services in only one facility. So what's interesting is very uncommon to do movie theaters in Australia. It's much more common in the U.S. and in Canada to do movie theaters. The school is much more common in Australia and less common in the U.S., partly because schools are a little less open in the U.S. 84% require weekly setup and tear down, which I think is the bane of the devil. Having our church plant currently does tear down and set up. As far as internet communications is one of the key things. Word of mouth is by far the most effective and important thing. But second, by far, before anything else, is internet social media. You're going to hear over and over again, internet social media have really, where mail-outs are still used by some, and actually 29% in Australia say that they're using mail-outs. By far, it's social media and internet.
So people connect with your church website before they're actually going to walk into your building. It's interesting, your website needs to say, here's where we meet, this is where we meet, this is where we meet. That's what it needs to say.
Yeah, I think pictures of where you meet, or maybe some videos even. I don't know anybody who comes visit a church anymore that doesn't visit a church first online. So that's just normal. All right, so jumping through, 77% say word of mouth is most common. We asked them, what's the most successful form? Not what did they do, but what's the most successful form? Word of mouth, internet communication. Those are successful form of publicity. Regular electronic communication, right? Years 1 through 5, Facebook by far, email newsletters, online services, things of that sort are all pretty common. As someone who loves Twitter, I was a little disappointed Twitter wasn't that strong, but it probably doesn't have the same ability for advertising that, say, a Facebook does as well. Onto this worship style, mostly contemporary, or when you put urban contemporary and blended and contemporary together, you get a super majority.
Yeah.
But there's kind of a mix there, and so it's difficult to define styles, and so you try to use language that you try to be descriptive, but it's kind of a mix. We use some of that language too to kind of reflect across the continents and across some history as well. When people kind of ask to describe their model of church, it's the missional model that is, which is higher, by the way, there than it is in the U.S. And Canada. And for purpose-driven, it's fascinating to me. I mean, I don't know. I know very few who are purpose-driven, church planners are purpose-driven today, but who use that language. But there's still some things that they still use model-wise. One of the things that's probably important to notice is that simple church and organic are pretty low. I think a couple things to remember there. Number one, this is a sample that it's tracked. There's a lot of simple church and organic churches that you can't track, and so that might be part of that as well. The next slide is interesting to me, particularly for Australia, which is so diverse, but 27% of congregations are seeking to reach a cross-cultural or multi-ethnic group from the beginning. In other words, 72% are not. And so it's interesting to see. We find this higher in Canada. People are more intentional with the multi-ethnic, and a little less. The numbers a little lower here in Australia.
Yeah, I was really surprised by this. I mean, we as a network are trying to encourage hub church planting and also multi-ethnic planting. Got a question from Jared. If you do have questions, now's the time to be starting to sort of send them through. But Jared just asked the question about, is there data on planting churches in a cross-cultural context? I mean, with a survey like this, how easy is it to pull out, the ethnic church planting data and understand, how effective they've been? And in particular, I guess one of the things that Jared mentions that he's seen anyway is especially with regard to university students from overseas. So we're seeing a lot of uni churches popping up that are reaching students who are here for 3 or 4 years because we're selling education services, becoming Christians, and then heading back, to the countries that they've come from. We don't have a lot of detailed data on that from this study. Is that correct, Ed?
I wouldn't think a study like this is your best go-to place. I think the missiological literature is more of a best go-to place, and so the Evangelical Missiological Journal and other things there's lots of stuff written on cross-cultural church planting. We've actually done a study in 30 different languages. We identified first-generation immigrant groups and how they were most effectively engaged with church planting. If you just Google that and just kind of look up first-generation immigrant church planting, so cross-cultural is that's first-generation immigrants is just a subset of cross-cultural. So what I would say is this kind of study gives you a good picture of averages and comparison by strategies. I wouldn't try to slice it at that level, or else you lose some of the effectiveness of the sample.
Yeah. But Australia's becoming more multicultural, more multi-ethnic, so we need to be working out how to reach that population.
Yeah, with you, Scott, I was kind of surprised that number was as low, the 27%. And Canada. Now you got to remember though, with Canada, Toronto and Vancouver, the majority of people who live in Toronto and Vancouver were born in another country other than Canada.
Yeah.
So I mean, Canada is probably it's unique in its cross-cultural. They call it visible minorities, the language they use in Canada. Moving forward, because we're
small groups. Yeah. What about small groups?
Small groups. High good percentage of people in small groups shows a surprising openness. I think, for example, 60% or more. In a small group, 80% of the people said they have at least 60% of the people involved in a small group. 81% of the congregations have small groups that meet primarily in homes, which tells you that the community is taking place in someone's house. And actually, when you look at this is a survey of planters. 39% say they're experiencing transformation in corporate worship. 37% say in small groups. That's actually pretty good. Most of the time, pastors think that most of life change takes place during the pastor's sermon. But statistically, people don't think that, but pastors actually do. Scott McConnell, what would you add on those before I jump into the rest?
On the multi-ethnic piece, there was an accompanying question right before it that asked if they target a specific group, and 69% indicated that they're targeting one demographic group. So really you hear kind of two schools of thought there, and definitely people on both sides can share the pros and cons of each. But definitely within a church planting community, you definitely have to be addressing one way or the other the explosion of different ethnicities in the culture there. And so whether it be with several targeted groups trying to reach them or with multi-ethnic, you definitely have to be making sure you're reaching out to everybody in the community.
Now, Scott, John from Mandurah in WA asks, what's been some of the most effective outreach methods for Australian churches? So can I get you to tell us about this?
Definitely. Some of the major outreach events that more than half of the New Church Works we're doing are fun social events to meet people in the community. It's hard to share Christ when you haven't even said hello to somebody. So definitely that's the first thing. Evangelistic meetings, so a very intentional strategy there is still very popular, and the invite, probably very thinly veiled. You're coming to hear about what we believe. Children's special events, another one that's very popular. And then even though the internet and social media are very strong, we do see some more traditional advertising, some mailed invitations and things, but notice that they're regarding some more intentionality, some services, some programs, some events. You're being intentional. What are we inviting them to? It's not just a service time on the sign. It's something that we're preparing for them, for someone who's not typically in church. Special prayer meetings, walking the neighborhood. That was actually how we worded the prayer walking in the survey. We slipped back into our vernacular of kind of the slang of prayer walking. Yep. Service projects to meet practical needs in the community. The service projects there, we noticed that was effective as we looked at some of the predictive items, but as a percentage of churches, this is actually a lower percentage than we see in the U.S. and Canada. So it's something that we had an evangelist challenge us the other day, that we don't need to make the gospel look better, but at the same time, we got to be introducing ourselves to the community somehow. And so the fun social events is definitely a very popular one, but hopefully the service projects is on a growth trend as well.
So Scott, can I clarify that? Are you saying that you see in church planting projects in the States, you see more church planters doing service projects in the local community, comparatively to Australian?
Yes, and in Canada and the U.S. both. And so, and again, if we weren't seeing that they were effective, I probably wouldn't highlight that. But the fact that we also saw that they're effective as being predictive of good outcomes in Australian churches, that's one to take notice of, especially if your church plant hasn't given that a lot of attention. How could you do that in keeping with who you are and how you're gifted as a church?
And what other activities did you see taking place in church plants?
There's definitely some patterns as far as delegating leadership. Obviously, almost everybody's doing this. You probably have a problem as a leader if you're not. Again, we saw earlier that you've got very strong small group participation by almost any standard. And so that's definitely something that's being emphasized. We even see at the bottom of this list Sunday school classes. So a couple different types of community that can be built, small groups, community groups, growth groups, Sunday school classes often have similar outcomes, little different approaches.
By Sunday school classes as well, you're talking about training courses. In Australia, we'd say Sunday school is your kids' church, but you're talking about actual training for evangelism, training for small group leading, all that sort of stuff. Is that what you mean?
Well, those are separate items, but they're building community. Even among the kids, you're building community as they come to a Sunday school class, or as adults come to a growth group. They're building community, and it's great to see so many people doing that, so many church plants doing that, and that's just something that, as we've studied transformational churches, that's got to be present in the church. Practical items like demographics and the evangelistic training are definitely there as well.
And what about, proactive stewardship development? These slides are quite helpful. Just let's run through them pretty quickly.
Yeah, I mean, they fit the theme of intentionality. And so on the financial front, do you actually have a plan from the very beginning of that new church work to be training people in good stewardship and biblical stewardship? So we see just a majority, 58%, doing that. Leadership training for new church members, helping them take next steps and taking some ownership of the church plant process and multiplication is a key piece there. We also see that a third, from really the very beginning, sharing that DNA that we are going to be multiplying. This isn't just about us. This isn't just about building our kingdom. It's about building the kingdom and to be investing in the kingdom. And so to be communicating that monthly, we see a third of new church works in Australia doing that. I would wager to say a number of the others may not have even thought about that as being something that needs to be a priority. But again, it sends just loads of messages to those in the congregation that we care about those outside the walls.
Yep. It's important to say participation as well.
Absolutely. Getting people involved, and we're going to see a big contrast here between those who have regular responsibilities within the church, and these are fantastic numbers to get people volunteering. But as we look at the next slide, how many are actually serving outside the walls, the numbers drop tremendously fast. So we're down to 11%, actually saying 60% or more of our congregation is serving outside the walls. So again, just in comparison to the U.S. and Canada, we see just a lot less emphasis on service, and so again, service by itself is not what we're talking about. It's service in Jesus Christ's name and with a verbal witness with it. Yep. But it's something that we see a stark difference there, and I think again it's that message of are you serving just to try to make us function, or are you serving so we can share the gospel with others? And really, those themes of support and experience and intentionality really all point to that same theme of, the support items are so that we can spend time on ministry. And so when the support's in place, the accounting help, even a few dollars out of my own wallet, it's going to mean that we spend our time on ministry. And when that message is coming through the whole congregation, you have a more externally focused church that's going to be sharing Christ more often.
Now, we've got a question from Ken asking about funding. So can you tell us about funding sources? So Ken from New South Wales asks about funding, and what did you find out about funding sources?
Well, of course, in general, let's give some descriptive statistics first. So source of initial funding, 89% church attendees, very common. 59% said one or more sponsoring churches. Obviously, these they can choose from more than one. 44% said the church's pastor or church staff. Financially, 38% said they raised money from a subordinate network. 36% said an affiliated denomination, which is actually pretty low. It would be higher in the States than in Canada. And then some got from an individual or a nonprofit foundation. Now, if you look to the next slide, the average total dollars received from the outside, from outside sources by year. Because remember, some of that be like giving from the congregation. So this is from the outside. And so rightly so, we see that declining. What's fascinating is that if we compare this to the Canadian sample or the U.S. sample, it would decline much faster. I think there's a sense that there's an acknowledgement, and a rightful acknowledgement, that Australia is going to take longer to get to self-sufficiency. And if you flip to the next slide, average total dollars received from the church members and attendees by year, it sort of reflects about the size of the church, and that makes sense, the size of the offering. So what you'd want to see is you want to see those lines cross. You want to see the outside support going down and the other support going up. And I think we see that. I think that's a healthy pattern. Now, not every church plant experiences that. Now, a couple of things we see is that there's not generally a direct correlation between funding and success or viability or things of that sort. Funding is not the panacea. It's a blessing to have. That's why we're in favor of bivocationalism and other things as well. but funding generally helps you get there faster. It doesn't lead to higher survivability, but if you're going to be surviving and doing well, it'll get you there faster. So that's some of the things we saw in funding. Now let me move on to
we're gonna have to wrap up very soon. So I'd like to finish on the denominational network support, because John from New South Wales, asked that question: what can denominations be doing to actually support church plants better? And
the numbers look pretty good. The denomination network support offered and received, and this is self-reported by the church planners, so 79% said they received mentoring, coaching, and or supervision. Now, what I would say is to denominational leaders who are watching, fund as you can, but it's far more important that you would care for the church planter, that you would mentor and coach and supervise and fit in the peer network and get through assessment. By the way, 60% church planter assessment program for church plants that came out of denominations is far too low. But the other things are decent. You should be up to 70 or 80% in church planter assessment, because there's just no reason you should be resourcing people that you haven't assessed, because it's bad for you, it's bad for them. So what we found is, if I could move some numbers around, I would really like to see those three bottom categories, accounting, legal work, and demographic, to be all in central services. Or maybe it's not necessarily the presis in Queensland, but you could say there's a group of us who are working together, and we're working together in Queensland to do this. And so I'd want to see those numbers go up. I'm pleased with the mentoring and the church planter peer network. I'd like to see assessment and then those other central services things go up. So by and large, denominations and networks are doing fair to well in Australia for supporting their church planners, with some changes we'd like to make. Now, we run out of time, but let me say this. Again, we're here to serve and have sought to serve churches in Australia. We recognize, I've met many of you as I've trained there, and I'll probably come back again in the near future, is that we recognize that we're doing a statistical analysis from afar. So I want to encourage you to wrestle with this data among leaders and denominational leaders and network leaders and pastors and churches, to wrestle and think through this data. What does this mean for us? Now, we'll publish more. We have a written document we're still in process. We're putting all this together. But as we lay all these things out, let this be a tool to do what the writer of Hebrews said, to provoke you to love and good deeds. We believe in what the Lord's doing there, and we thank you that we can be a small part.
Great. Thanks, Ed and Scott. It's been a real pleasure having you this morning, just giving us a taste. I feel like we could do a number of webinars on this and have loads of questions. As we've said, we're going to be slowly releasing more of the data over the next couple of months and letting you know what's been found in that. I think two things that I'm taking away from this are the importance of momentum, in church planting in Australia, and I guess the slowness, but the importance also of intentionality as well. So if I'm going to leave you those two words, momentum and intentionality, and I'm going to hand it back over to Ben.
Thanks so much, Scott, and to Ed and to Scott for that incredible discussion this morning about what can help church plants work. And as Scott just mentioned, let me reiterate, we will be sending all of this out to you very soon, this entire PowerPoint presentation, to help you out. Before we sign off today, thank you for participating in this, and we thank also EA Insurance once again for their incredible support of the planter sessions. Now, I just want to point you towards the next planter session that's coming up real soon, coming up on the 6th of April at 9:30 a.m. What to do with more than one culture. You can join David Williams and Peter Coe as they talk through the challenges of preaching the gospel to disparate ethnicities, socioeconomic and cultural groups, as new congregations are evangelized into existence. So please join us next time. And to register, go to the Geneva Push website, genevapush.com. Sign up right now to be part of the next planter session. Join us next time, as the slide tells us. I've been Ben McCacken. I'll see you next time as well. Thank you for joining us.